The year was 1944 in the city of Alcolu, South Carolina, in a segregated community where whites and blacks lived separated by a railroad. It was in this town that a young 14-year-old George Stinney had a brief conversation that would change both his life and his family's forever. George came from a humble background with a father, George Stinney Sr., who worked in a sawmill as a sharecropper, and a mother, Amy Stinney, who was a cook at Alcolu's all-black school. He was the second of 5 siblings, and thanks to his father's work, they all lived in a 3-room home provided by his father's company. It wasn't much, but it was an honest living for the Stinney family. All of that, however, quickly turned around with the disappearance of Betty June and Mary Emma Thames, 2 young white sisters who lived in the same town. Unfortunately for George, they weren't complete strangers. One day in March 1944, George and his sister were on their way home after grazing their family cow when they met Betty June, aged 11, and Mary Emma, aged 7, for the first time. The 2 girls were on an adventure in search of a fruit called a maypop, stopping only to ask George and his sister where they could find the fruit before heading off on their way. When the 2 girls didn't make it back by sundown, the police were alerted, and a search party was immediately organized. Hundreds of people, including George's father, spent all night searching. In an effort to help, George informed the authorities that he had seen the girls on his way home, telling them they had said they would be going to the railroad. The police kept this information in mind, and at sunrise, the girls' bodies were found in a muddy ditch. 7-year-old Emma had a hole bored through her skull, while 11-year-old Betty June had suffered blows to the head. The autopsy reported that she had received 7 blows from a round instrument, leaving the back of her head a mass of crushed bones. The town was stumped. Who would want to harm 2 little girls? 2 theories about the fate of the girls began to surface. The first, which heavily implicated young George, was that he followed them after their meeting, assaulting them and then killing them with a railroad spike while attempting to rape Betty June. The second theory, whispered as an unfounded rumor, suggested that the girls stopped by the house of a prominent man in the community to ask if his good-natured wife would like to accompany them on their travels. Though she couldn't go, her son offered to give them a ride in his lumber mill truck. They apparently accepted his offer and were whisked away, never to be seen again. However, the police weren't particularly interested in investigating a possible white suspect, not when they had a perfectly good black child to scapegoat. So the police did what they were trained to do. They picked up 14-year-old George and his older brother Johnny, arresting them as the culprits responsible for the gruesome murders. The odds were stacked heavily against poor George. Not only was he surrounded by white policemen who seemed to believe he was a murderer, but his family wasn't even allowed into the interrogation room or the courtroom. George's questioning was relentless, with officers screaming at him to admit his guilt, asking if he had tried to rape Betty June and failed. For hours, they mentally assaulted the poor child, all without a lawyer or his family by his side. He was all alone. A trial was held to determine George Stinney's fate. The charges were brought, and a court session was held. His publicly appointed attorney, Charles Plowden, didn't seem very interested in proving his client's innocence. The trial lasted just a few hours, and there was little to no defense for George. In fact, the court didn't even seem to consider that George could have been innocent. Evidence was barely presented, and George was found guilty in a matter of minutes. The all-white jury convicted him in less than 10 minutes, a decision that took just as long as the deliberation itself. In a segregated South, George's trial was an example of how the justice system was applied differently based on race. Despite the lack of proper legal representation and the shaky evidence, the trial ended with a conviction. In the following months, George was sentenced to death by electric chair, and an appeal for a new trial was denied. The execution of George Stinney, who was just 14 years old, became a symbol of racial injustice and the failures of the American legal system during that era. George Stinney's case remained a deeply troubling part of South Carolina's history for many years. His execution was carried out swiftly, but questions about the fairness of the trial persisted. In 2014, more than 70 years after his execution, a judge vacated George's conviction, ruling that his trial had been a grave injustice. However, for many, the damage had been done, and the memory of George Stinney's tragic fate serves as a powerful reminder of how systemic racial injustice was embedded in the American legal system.